From the moment Arthur was born, he filled my life with joy. He was always smiling and had the most inquisitive little mind. He had every costume and action figure and would spend hours dressing up and pretending he had all their superpowers. But if Arthur could ask for one final thing, it would be that he was remembered for his superpowers. And Arthur's superpower was his smile.
The child whose murder shamed a nation. And the adults who filled his life with torment.
They were living a hot tub lifestyle. They were living it up, while Arthur was forced to stand up against the wall for up to 16 hours a day.
A suburban house of horrors.
There was a clear pattern that had developed of utter cruelty.
And a story concocted by a dad and stepmom, now dissected frame by frame. The Watcher.
As a doctor in emotional intelligence, I'm trained to look beyond the words and see what's really happening below the surface.
The Listener.
I'm a professor of linguistics. That involves listening to what people say, how they say it, and what they intend to communicate.
And The Profiler.
As a consultant forensic psychologist, I've come face to face with some of the world's most notorious criminals, studying them, profiling them, and discovering what drives them.
When I tried to get him off the floor from headbutting the floor, he headbutted me and he kicked me and he's hit me.
She looks feral in this image here. You can see the glare of the eyes, but she's actually feeling disgust when she's talking about Arthur.
I picked him up, put him on the sofa, poured water in his mouth.
You don't pour water into a child, even if that child's conscious. So for me, it raises alarm bells.
There's something really sadistic in allowing the child to watch everybody else enjoy those treats, but yet he's not allowed to have that.
From the first moment of the cover-up
he threw himself on the floor, his headbutt in the floor,
to the final lie.
The last 6 months, he's battered both my kids. He's smashed this house to pieces.
She's doing a few dry sniffs and she's pretending to wipe tears, but she's trying to mimic sadness.
The story of the little boy who broke Britain's heart.
Looking back at Arthur's short life, he never really stood a chance.
December 2021. And football crowds around Britain pay tribute to a young fan whose life came to a tragic and premature end. His name, Arthur Labinjo Hughes.
Arthur was a huge Birmingham City fan, and one of his favourite possessions was a Birmingham shirt, and he wore it whenever he could. But what was really moving to see was all clubs of all colours came together and paid tribute to him that weekend. So on the 6-minute mark of the game, they paused to clap for Arthur, and those 6 minutes represented 1 year of his life.
Arthur was born in 2014, only child of Thomas Hughes and Olivia Labinjo Halcrow. 2 years later, the couple split whilst still in their 20s.
Olivia's a really bright woman. She was privately educated. She went to Solihull School, which is a fee-paying school and probably one of the most prestigious in the Midlands region. She then went on to study at Nottingham University, and she was also in the Territorial Army at one point. Unfortunately, she did drink too much and had some mental health problems, and ultimately I think that led to the breakdown of her relationship with Thomas Hughes.
Following the split, Olivia and Arthur shared her flat in Birmingham. Soon afterwards, she began seeing Gary Cunningham, a local man with a history of violence.
Olivia and Gary Cunningham's relationship was a toxic one. They met on an alcohol awareness course, and we know that there was violence on both sides. We know that Olivia did make complaints about Cunningham's violence towards her, but she never followed them through. Then one day in February 2019, in their flat in Birmingham, they had a huge fight, and Olivia ended up stabbing Gary Cunningham a number of times, and it was fatal.
Although charged with murder, Olivia was later convicted of manslaughter and sent to prison for 11 years. Her sentence meant sole custody of Arthur passed to his father, Thomas Hughes. For the rest of 2019, Arthur stayed with Hughes in an annex of his parents' house in the Shirley district of Solihull. In August that year, he started dating Emma Tustin, a 30-year-old mother of 4 who lived 2 miles away. It was from her house, 10 months on, that she called 999.
Ambulance service, is the patient breathing?
Barely.
Okay, is he breathing right now, though?
Is he breathing, Tom? He keeps taking big dark breaths. Basically, my 6-year-old stepson is falling, he's banged his head.
Okay.
And while he was on the floor, he's banged his head another 5 times.
Okay.
There's several things to note that we can summarise from the call overall. The first relates to how Emma Tustin assigns agency to a 6-year-old. She is deliberately assigning all responsibility for Arthur's actions, for Arthur's injuries, if you like, to him. He's causing these injuries to himself. It's nothing to do with Emma Tustin.
He's fallen, he's banged his head.
Okay.
And while he was on the floor, he's banged his head another 5 times.
Okay.
Now, if you follow through with this logically, he's banged his head once, and then he's banged his head another 5 times. That's her words. That's 6 times, which leads us to ask, OK, if she can count how many times he's banged his head, why isn't she trying to stop him after the 2nd attempt?
And while he was on the floor, he's banged his head another 5 times.
Okay.
What she also does is avoid using his name directly, so the name Arthur isn't used by her at all in this clip from the 999 call, and instead Emma Tustin refers to him using he 30 times.
He's in and out, he's got a big lump, but he's banged his head, his head is 6. He's losing colour, he's very pale, banged his head, he's barely breathing, he's lost colour, he's basically been treating us all up. He's lost just at the minute.
Him 6 times.
I'm trying to pick him up in the process. He's washed him down to get him, doing him, but I've got him up.
His 6 times, and himself 3 times.
His head, banged his head on his head.
No way.
Banged his head with a lump on his head, flat on his back. Threw himself, done to himself, knocked himself out.
We're talking about 45 instances where she could have named Arthur directly, and she's opting not to. So we've got a clear indication of distancing here. She's identifying her role as caregiver, but not identifying him in a way that shows intimacy.
The call wasn't Tustin's first brush with the emergency services.
Emma Tustin had a chaotic background. She left school without any qualifications. She was arrested for shoplifting when she was young and went missing a few times. She had 4 children with 3 different fathers, and once, when one partner threatened to leave her, she tried to kill herself by jumping off the top floor of a multi-storey car park, which left her with multiple broken bones and long-term mental health problems.
Following her suicide attempt, 2 of Tustin's 4 children were removed from her care. Within weeks of meeting Hughes, she became pregnant again, and the 2 announced plans to marry. As they began spending more and more time together, Arthur's behaviour underwent a dramatic change, noted by staff at his school.
Arthur had been bright and he'd been bubbly, he'd been very animated, but suddenly he's withdrawn. He seems preoccupied with ideas that his father might suddenly disappear and leave him, or maybe his father will kill him. He's obsessed with weapons, guns and murder, and this is just not characteristic of him at all. And I think it was too easily put down to the fact that, well, His mother's in prison, and this is what this is all about. And yes, this is new domestic arrangement. This is just a blip. This is just him trying to adjust. It wasn't really taken as seriously as it should have been, bearing in mind that this is a child who has gone from actually being really quite stable to very, very unhappy in a short space of time.
Is he awake?
He's half in and out, but he's banged his head quite hard.
Is his breathing noisy or abnormal?
Is it noisy or abnormal? It's barely there, he's barely breathing, he's in and out.
She's describing a child that is having difficulty breathing following several bangs to his head. You know, it's pretty gruesome content, and we don't have a voice quality that suggests any emotional state on her part. What you get instead is her presenting Arthur in a negative light.
Is it noisy or abnormal? It's barely there, he's barely breathing, he's in and out. He's basically been treating us all up. He's threw himself on the floor, he's headbutting the floor.
So we're now doing negative other presentation. We don't seem to be concerned for the child who's in and out of consciousness. We're now continuing to push this idea of Arthur being the agent.
He's headbutting the floor. I'm trying to pick him up in the process, he's headbutting me in the process.
So this is all about blame shifting. We have Emma Tustin representing herself as trying to pick him up. So she's trying to help, but she becomes the victim in the process. He's headbutted me in the process. But remember, this is a child that, by her own admission, is barely breathing at this point. That's a child in peril. And so it makes for difficult hearing.
How old is he?
He's 6, nearly 7.
Old. Okay.
Yeah.
Right, there is, mate.
He's losing, he's very pale, but obviously it's a big bang. He's knocked himself out by the look of him.
And he's barely breathing now.
He's breathing, he's barely breathing, he's lost just at the minute.
Following Emma Tustin's 999 call, paramedics rushed Arthur to the intensive care unit at Birmingham Children's Hospital. As doctors assessed his injuries, she stayed behind to answer police questions, with Arthur's father leaving all the talking to her.
Just briefly, what happened?
Basically, he'd gone out to get me a birthday cake for the kids. Arthur was told to sit on the thinking step. Arthur's put himself all over the floor. He's banged himself off the radiator. He's hit me, he's kicked me in the process of me trying to get him back on the thinking step. He's then gone on all fours on the floor, and I've told him to get up. And I shut the door over, and all I heard was a crack off the floor. He was headbutting the floor on all fours. Headbutted the floor once, said, "Off, get up, you're going to hurt yourself. I've phoned your dad." He went, "I don't care." At that point, he was fine. And then he dropped his head again as I've tried to bear hug him and pick him up, and he headbutted the floor 3 times.
So we've got this little rant from his stepmother. And these aren't just words, because if you look at the face as she's describing the actions, we see her showing the emotion of disgust. Now, disgust is indicated on the face by 2 little muscles. It's a pair of muscles that go from the side of the nostril to the upper lip, and it raises the lip like this. It's very hard to do and isolate that muscle. So her nose is wrinkled at this point, and we see this, what we call a nasolabial furrow. It's the furrow between the cheek and the upper lip. And when that deepens, as the way we see it here, she's actually feeling disgust when she's talking about Arthur.
He was headbutting the floor on all fours.
Now, if we take Arthur's father and look at Hughes on the right, he's detached almost, he's leaving her to this, but he's showing us signs of anxiety and stress too. So he's scratching his head, he's rubbing his neck, he's moving his hands around the front of his face. He seems to be sighing, he's almost distancing himself from the interview. He wants nothing to do with this, but he is clearly anxious.
Thomas Hughes was 27 and had worked as a plasterer, builder's labourer and amateur football coach. According to friends and family, he'd doted on Arthur for the first 5 years of his life.
Even though Arthur's natural mother and Thomas Hughes had split up, they were still loving, caring parents to Arthur. He used to say, "It's me and Arthur against the world." Arthur used to love wearing superhero costumes, and Thomas's nickname for him was Bats, after Batman. And when social services went to see Thomas Hughes when he first took on sole responsibility for Arthur, they themselves said that he was a protective influence.
But from the start of his relationship with Tustin, Hughes had allowed her to set rules for his son and to decide the punishments when he broke them.
Tustin starts to say that she's really struggling with Arthur's behaviour, and it seems that she's got a real growing resentment of him. So you have to wonder, was she as happy as she said that she was in taking on another woman's child? Did she resent the care that she had to give Arthur, and obviously the time that that took? Did she resent the time that he spent with his father? We can only really guess at these things, but a growing dislike for the boy was evident, and it was evident in a very short space of time.
In March 2020, when England went into its first national COVID lockdown, Hughes moved in to Tustin's home permanently, taking his young son with him. Over the next few months, her dislike of Arthur increased further.
I think it's pretty obvious she was jealous of Arthur and the fact that he was competing with her, she felt, for Thomas Hughes's attention. But I think there was another reason too. Olivia, Arthur's natural mother, had recently applied through the courts to resume contact with Arthur. And I think that Emma Tustin probably thought that that would obviously bring Hughes back into contact with Olivia too. And she saw that as a real threat.
Just briefly, what happened?
Basically, he'd gone out to get me a birthday card of cake for kids.
So if we compare this with the 999 call, she's using similar strategies throughout.
Arthur was told to sit on the thinking step.
So Arthur was told to sit on the thinking step, and we're supposed to associate that with the fact that he's probably been naughty, and that's why he's got to go on the thinking step. And then she tells us Arthur's thrown himself all over the floor.
Arthur's thrown himself all over the floor. He's banged himself off the radiator. He's hit me. He's kicked me in the process of me trying to get him back on the thinking step.
So she's the helpful caregiver who's trying to get this willful child to behave, and this is a child that's acting up no matter what she does, is basically the message she's trying to give at this point.
At that point, he was fine, and then he dropped his head again as I've tried to bear hug him and pick him up, and he headbutted the floor 3 times.
Here, on this carpet?
Round about, the door was shut, so if you go in, I'll show you. Because it's probably about here his head was, but it's concrete, there's no underlay under that.
Pay attention to what she says next, because she's wanting to come across as someone who's trying to do all the things a caregiver would, but the logic of this doesn't work, and the wording of this doesn't work.
But he'd banged his head 3 or 4 times. Obviously, then went and picked him up. He'd knocked himself unconscious. I picked him up, put him on the sofa, poured water in his mouth.
You don't pour water into a child. Even if that child's conscious, you give a child a drink or you allow a child to take some sips. But the language choices, especially for a child by your own admission is unconscious, doesn't come across as someone who's caring for a child. So for me, it raises alarm bells.
So you've come in, he's banged his head 3 or 4 times
I was
here.
in the kitchen, then I'd sat down in the living room and that's when he threw himself on the floor.
And you heard him banging his head. So what did you do?
So you've heard him bang his head, and she repeats that back. But what's going on underneath the surface is she's peeking now in fear. How do we know that? If you look at the eyes, she's in wide-eyed fear, and the mouth is stretched back horizontally. So these are the 2 key features of fear. So the eyes widening, as you see at this point, and the mouth is stretched back. You see little creases and dimples in her cheeks to tell us this resource muscle here is engaged. So it's a fear reaction to now having to respond to a prompt from the police officer. and she's got to try and explain that so it sounds sensible and sounds logical. But she's still engaged in blame. She's pointing a finger. And this is all Arthur's fault.
Concerns about Arthur's welfare had been voiced repeatedly in the months before the 999 call. There were worries about how he was being treated, not only by Tustin, but by his own dad.
Family members are starting to notice that Arthur's father's behaviour is changing towards him, his attitude is changing towards him. He's becoming far more strict with Arthur, he's far more punitive with him, and often he's doing it at the behest of Tustin. So she is telling him that he needs to be stricter, that he needs to deal with this kind of behaviour in a certain kind of way, and he's going along with that. So this is a real change in the man, and obviously it's impacting on Arthur in a terrible way at a time when he needs nurturing, he needs care, more so than probably most little boys of that age. And yet what he's getting is brutality, harshness, punishment.
It's hard to say where the first indications of physical abuse came. Certainly there was an occasion where Arthur told one of his uncles that she had pushed him against a wall. Other relatives noticed that whilst she treated her other children really well, she tended to disparage Arthur, to treat him cruelly, to punish him, to insult him a lot. And that was what was really clearly giving people concerns.
In April 2019, Arthur's paternal grandmother noticed marks on his body and asked the local social services department to investigate.
The picture that was taken, which showed quite extensive bruising on Arthur's back, and the visit by social workers only happened a day or two later. Those bruises couldn't have disappeared. And yet, when the social workers visited, they didn't seem to carry out a very close inspection of Arthur. They were told that those bruises were caused during a play fight with one of Emma Tustin's other children.
The social services team accepted the explanation and the assurances that Arthur was being well cared for. They concluded there were no safeguarding concerns, but they'd been duped.
When the social workers came round, they saw Arthur happily playing in the paddling pool. What they didn't know was that was one of the few times that he was actually allowed out of the house. And it meant that the picture that they got of Arthur had all been staged and manipulated by Arthur's dad and his girlfriend. Now, we know at the time social services were under a huge amount of pressure, the country was in lockdown, they were facing more calls than ever before. But this wasn't their finest hour.
June the 17th, 2020. Around 10 hours after Arthur's admission to hospital, doctors withdrew the 6-year-old's life support. As well as the recent catastrophic brain trauma, they found 130 more unexplained injuries. The investigation into a supposed household accident was now a murder inquiry.
Then you heard him banging his head. So what did you do?
Meanwhile, the two obvious suspects were sticking to their original story, that Arthur had purposely and repeatedly struck his own head against a concrete floor.
So what did you do?
I came out to him and told him to get up. He told me no. So I tried to bear hug him and put my arms underneath him and pick him up. And he dropped and he banged his head another 3 times off the floor.
So some interesting body language going on here. And as soon as we get the "what did you do?" we get another fear expression.
So what did you do?
So the eyes have gone wide again. That wide-eyed fear and a little eye closure here, which is for about 5 frames. She's closing herself off from the description. So she's given a logical description of how he injured himself. But she's anxious and fearful about this response, and she's eye blocking, distancing herself from the words that are coming out of her mouth. and that should make us suspicious. It's a big red flag when people close their eyes when they're describing something. So why are you disconnecting yourself from this statement that Arthur did this to himself? What's also worrying is she's describing picking him up.
I put my arms underneath him and pick him up, and he dropped, and he banged his head another 3 times off the floor.
So she's picking him up, but she's doing actions which are gesturing downwards. So she's using a double arm gesture that's going downwards. So this kind of suggests that if she's having a little flashback to this moment, are these actions that we're seeing from her hands at this point mimicking what was really going on with her holding Arthur and pushing him towards the floor? So the behaviour kind of suggests that, rather than preventing him doing that.
So he's unresponsive?
Yeah.
In the weeks before his death, Arthur's health and appearance deteriorated. When one of his uncles voiced his concerns to the police, they took no action, as they believed social services were already investigating. Due to the pandemic, Arthur's teachers had also been unable to keep tabs on his welfare. Even when his school reopened a week before the 999 call, his father and Tustin wouldn't allow him to return.
Domestic violence of all types really skyrocketed during lockdown, and you know what they say, domestic abusers always work from home. So I think that where Arthur was concerned, this would have forced him to spend more time with Emma Tustin, which of course would have been difficult for both of them because she hates caring for Arthur. She doesn't find it rewarding. She, you know, thoroughly dislikes having to care for him. And, well, you can imagine the terrible time that he was having in her company. But can we blame lockdown? No, I don't think we can blame lockdown. This would have happened, I think, anyway. I think that lockdown just made the situation more intense, so made it happen that bit more quickly.
Towards the end of her police interview, Tustin began talking about Arthur's behaviour throughout lockdown, and for the first time appeared to become emotional.
Like I say, he's like the last 6 months, he's battered both my kids. He's smashed this house to pieces. He's battered his dad. He's hit me.
There's no sadness going on there. She's doing a few dry sniffs, and she's got the brows squeezed together. She's pretending to wipe tears, which we can't see, even with a close-up here. There's no dampness around the eyes, but she's trying to mimic sadness.
He's hit me. When I tried to get him off the floor from headbutting the floor, he headbutted me, and he kicked me and he's hit me.
So he's headbutted her. When somebody tells me there's a headbutt, it's a headbutt on the forehead. He's 6, and she must be 5'7". So what's he headbutting? Your shins, your knees? So this doesn't fit. It seems to be fabricated.
Yesterday we went to my friend's house and he pushed me down 5 stairs. You're not my real mum, I hate ya. I'm gonna get my mum to kill you, he said.
So we're now getting to the crux of the relationship. That maybe Arthur, it's true that Arthur has described as you're not my real mum. Maybe in the moments where he's being abused or being mistreated or not being fed or not being cared for, Arthur's retaliating. He had spirit. But that seems to be the trigger which has caused this anger to escalate to a position where she's just leaking fury.
You're not my real mum, I hate ya.
She looks feral in this image here, where the brows are down. You can see the vertical wrinkles between the brows. You can see the glare of the eyes. And this is almost disgust combined with anger. And this is hate.
I'm gonna get my mum to kill you, he said. And even so, I've done my best for that kid.
Now we've got some sadness. How do we know we've got sadness here? We've got the mouth turning down, we've got the brows raised in the middle, we've got a triangulation of the eyes. So these are the features of real sadness. This is the first time we've seen it towards the end of the interview. We're hearing the voice break.
I tried to get him off the floor.
So the two theories are, Is she sad because she knows she's probably lost Arthur at this point? Or is it the potential loss of a liberty once the truth comes out? And when you string together the disgust, the fury, the hatred, and the projection and the rationalisation and the defence, she's almost building a case here on the fly, and you only see this concern at the end, I'm afraid the evidence is swinging towards the theory that this sadness is for herself. It's the pitiful realisation that the mess she's got herself into from damaging Arthur is going to have consequences now.
A man and a woman are being questioned following the death of a 6-year-old boy in the West Midlands. Arthur Labinjo Hughes succumbed to what doctors have described as an unsurvivable brain injury following an incident at his home in Solihull. Ambulance crew...
Piecing together the full details leading to Arthur's death would take several weeks, but detectives identified Tustin and Hughes as the perpetrators within hours.
When West Midlands police officers took their mobile phones off them, that's really where the case was pretty much decided there and then. But there was so much evidence on those phones, text messages between the two, detailing Arthur's punishments, but also a clear pattern that had developed during those month or so during lockdown of utter cruelty.
The texts showed Tustin blaming Arthur for causing arguments in the house and complaining about having to look after him. In one exchange, she threatened to split with Hughes if Arthur stayed. The couple patched up their row, and soon Hughes was mimicking and even encouraging her abuse of his son.
When you hear some of the language that they used about Arthur, it's really heartbreaking and disturbing. Tustin describes him as Satan and Hitler. She calls him the C word. And Hughes, instead of defending his son in his replies, he calls his son a weasel. And they seem to egg one another on. So she will say to Hughes the punishment that she's going to give to this poor little boy. And in response, he said things like, take his neck off or just finish him.
The big mystery is, how did Hughes turn from this actually concerned and good father into this dreadful, abusive, I don't even want to call him a father, who is encouraging his partner to end the life of his son? The fact is that Arthur had been demonised, and therefore he was deserving of violence. What they were calling Arthur is very, very significant. They were referring to him as the devil's child, Satan, Hitler. Now, this might just seem on the surface like insults, but actually it's not. And there's a very clear psychological function to this kind of language. It turns Arthur into something evil, nefarious, less than human, Satan, a demon. And it allows them to treat him, therefore, in a way that is less than human.
Tustin had also used her phone to keep a record of Arthur's supposedly bad behaviour. But what she captured on tape exposed her own spiteful attitude towards him.
When you hear the "no one loves me," you sense hopelessness as well as helplessness. And this is even more harrowing when you hear that "no one's going to feed me." It's said 6 times, and at one point we hear a little child's voice say, "I'm going to give you a cuddle." And so that's a little child in the same house showing empathy to Arthur.
No one's gonna feed me. I'm gonna give her a cuddle.
So we can assume, because of their ages, an adult needs to be present as well. A little child can tell Arthur needs something, but the adults in the house at the same time don't come and give him what he needs.
As harrowing as they were, the audio recordings only told part of the story. Along with the sound, there were pictures.
It was quite bizarre, but Emma Tustin had wired her own house with CCTV. And she told police this was because of some trouble that she'd had with her neighbours. But what's unusual is that there weren't just cameras outside the house, there were cameras inside the house, looking into her own living room, kitchen area, hallway. There was one incident in particular which shows just how cruel this couple were. They're seen sitting on the sofa, enjoying a McDonald's, laughing and joking together. At the same time, their little 6-year-old boy is standing up, facing the wall, not allowed to move, while they eat this food in front of him. On another occasion, it was the hottest day of the year, and outside the house, an ice cream van pulls up, and you see Arthur's dad going and buying 2 cones of ice cream. It wasn't for Arthur or any of the children. Those ice cream cones were for Thomas Hughes and his girlfriend Emma Tustin. So they sat there and ate that ice cream in front of Arthur. What was Arthur doing? They had forced him to wear a onesie, a thick onesie, and he had to stand up in that onesie while them two sat on the sofa eating an ice cream.
This is more than just neglect. This is starvation, but with a really aggravated element to it. There's something really sadistic, isn't there, in allowing the child to watch everybody else enjoy those treats, but yet he's not allowed to have that. The message is, you're bad, you don't deserve this, and we're going to do this in front of you, and you can think about what you're missing out on. There's an element of enjoying his discomfort. There really is a big element of enjoying his discomfort.
The mental ordeal didn't end there. Arthur had few possessions, but there was one he valued above all.
Arthur was accused of tearing a family photo. Sort of thing that you might well have done. Little children do things like that. But to punish him, he had his Birmingham City top taken off him and cut it into little pieces as a punishment. This is a little boy, loved his football. And it just shows the lengths to which their cruelty extended.
June the 16th, 2020, and the most heartbreaking footage of all. A distressed Arthur, waking up after a night on the living room floor, too weak even to lift his bedclothes. Later that same morning, Tustin would claim this frail and emaciated boy had summoned the strength to injure himself and her. Within 24 hours, he was dead.
He's basically been treating us all like he's threw himself on the floor, he's headbutting the floor. I'm trying to pick him up in the process, he's headbutting me in the process.
October 2021. When Tustin and Hughes went on trial at Coventry Crown Court, the jury heard the full story of Arthur's life and death at their hands. Tustin had killed him by banging his head against a hard surface repeatedly. But the post-mortem also revealed a sustained pattern of abuse by both her and his father.
There were broken bones or evidence of repeated beatings and physical punishment over the previous couple of months. And another thing they discovered was that he had high levels of salt in him. That could only have been administered in the form of food or drink. And it became clear that ultimately that Emma Tustin, as part of the punishment regime, had been adding salt to his food and drink. And that had helped to poison him as well, which made him even more weak, along with the starvation and everything else that was going on.
When I look at the salt poisoning, the lethal amounts of salt that she was administering to him. Is this just more sadistic behaviour? Well, I don't think it is. I think that she intended to kill him with salt because it would be easier for her to explain away as a medical condition rather than what it really is, which is a violent act, a violent abusive act.
The jury rejected the pair's pleas of innocence. Tustin, who delivered the fatal blow, was convicted of murder and jailed for life with a minimum of 29 years. Hughes, who encouraged the abuse, was found guilty of manslaughter and jailed for a minimum of 21 years. The judge said he'd allowed his love for his son to be obliterated by his infatuation with Tustin.
Looking back at Arthur's short life, he never really stood a chance. As soon as that relationship started between his father and Tustin, his fate was sealed, really. But Hughes, he's not innocent in this, not by a long stretch. When you look at the kind of language that he used, he actively encouraged Tustin. So he's just as sadistic and nasty himself. He didn't strike the fatal blow, but to my mind, he's just as responsible.
Arthur's case was not unique. In 2021, the NSPCC said cases of child abuse and neglect jumped by a quarter, with 72 cases a day in England alone. But the story of this defenseless boy, tormented and killed by his supposed carers and failed by the authorities, caused an unprecedented level of grief as well as anger.
So this is from my daughter Olivia, Labinjo Hughes, Arthur's mom. Following the verdict of my son's trial, I'd like to take this opportunity to focus on the life Arthur lived and to celebrate the little beautiful boy I knew and loved deeply. The details of Arthur's case are harrowing and incomparable, but I want people to know who Arthur was, from his huge smile and personality to his gentle and caring nature. All mothers are biased, and I believe that their children are the best, and I'm no different. Arthur was the light of my life. He wasn't just my only child, he was my best friend. Never did I imagine he would have been taken from this world so early in his life.
Since the trial, an independent review has said that family concerns about Arthur were disregarded or not taken seriously enough, and that police and social workers failed to fully investigate the bruises on his body 2 months before his death. Among the key proposals, a new dedicated network of child protection teams made up of police, healthcare staff, and social workers in every area. But no review can answer the most troubling question of all. How could 2 adults subject a 6-year-old child to such sustained torment and torture?
So we have used the real father, and he's fueled and enabled this situation. He's allowed it to happen. And Tustin is his stepmom, who tries to point the blame towards the 6-year-old for the inability of her to manage his behaviour. We've evolved as parents to care for our children. I'd die for my children. Most people would do. But to stand by and let your child be mistreated and die, how can a father do that? And Tustin, she's a stepmom who reveals, even talking about this makes me emotional. But the rationalisation of the bad behaviour is a poor defence. And it's just heartbreaking to see parents who can let that happen.